Hi, this is Christina.
And this is Sarah.
This sprint, we really focused on need finding. So what you're looking at right now is our need finding script. So we had users go through an Angular scope tutorial. So we had some pre-task questions. So just trying to get their understanding of how familiar they were with web development and then with front-end frameworks, and then just asking them how they normally approach learning new tech.
And in particular, for the users who would be considered experts on a particular topic, we were interested in recent projects they've worked on and recent utilizations of those technologies, and especially problems they ran into while trying to implement those technologies, how they were able to sort of intuit their way around the problem, how, if at all, they resolved it, and what tutorials and resources they found most useful for that. And our reasoning behind these questions is the primary focus of our need finding for this week was defining a little more of a concrete research question and scope for our research with respect to what users' high-level problems that they encounter while learning are.
Yeah, so now I'll show you what the actual tutorial was that we made them look through. So it's AngularJS Scopes. It's written by Carbon 5, which is a consulting tech company. There's code snippets here, and then there's some interactive parts of it too.
Basically, we just had users sort of work through this tutorial, reading through it and talking out loud as they read through it to describe sort of their thinking, whether things were making sense, how they liked the interactive examples, and basically just how everything was sort of settling in their heads. And then at the end, we asked users to do a couple things. First, we asked them to sort of qualitatively describe their experience with the structure of the tutorial. Then we asked them to rank on a scale of 1 to 7 how confident they feel about scopes in Angular after the tutorial. I think that we asked them to rate it based on how comfortable they would be giving like
a 2-minute talk.
A 2-minute talk on the subject.
So then after those post-tutorial questions, we actually then went to AngularJS applications to do MVC. There's multiple examples, and for this specific example, it's written in AngularJS. So we had then the users determine what they thought, what scopes were probably involved in this project.
We were interested primarily in how effectively they were able to apply the sort of conceptual description of scopes to a particular context, whether someone who wanted to make a to-do app could come up with the scopes that they would probably need, or based on the directives that this application used to talk about the scopes that said directives invoked, etc. And so what we found was pretty interesting. We had previously been focusing intently on learning two-way JavaScript binding frameworks in particular, and how people learned particular professional web technologies. Looking at all of our need finding in context, we observed that there were actually a couple of higher level questions that learners were consistently encountering where that manifested themselves in more targeted concerns. Do you want to?
So yeah, what we realized was that there was actually a more interesting question with knowledge gaps with users and exactly how they find what they don't know or how they even realize what they don't know. So in particular, in a couple of our observations, we noticed that users were able to express that they felt like they were missing something, that they were missing a prerequisite. A direct quote from a user was, I wish I knew what the prerequisites were. So we found that sometimes they knew exactly what they were missing, and sometimes they'd actually leave the tutorial and go Google a term that they had been familiar with but needed a refresher on. For example, one of our users ended up looking up what MVC and two-way binding was, and another looked up how to access the scope of a parent directive.
For other users, though, they weren't exactly sure what they were missing, even though they could sort of tell that something wasn't quite right. And for these users in particular, it was really difficult to be able to do the kind of just-in-time learning that the users from the previous situation were able to do, primarily because they didn't know exactly what terms they had to Google to refresh their memory. They weren't able to search Stack Overflow for, an ELI5 or a brief explanation of a particular concept because they didn't even know what concepts they were they had to look up, or what technology that concept was associated with.
Yeah, and then sometimes they just didn't know what they were missing. So in some examples,
or they didn't know they were missing anything.
Yeah, they were missing anything. So for people with more limited web development experience, this tutorial was was a little too advanced for them, and they weren't able to follow that they were missing much larger things. So, for example, one of the users actually turned out she didn't understand what the DOM was, which was a key part of what AngularJS works with.
And in our previous need finding, we had seen this problem crop up a lot with less experienced web developers. For instance, we had one participant who was looking through some sample code that used jQuery, and the variables that the variable names representing jQuery objects had their names prefixed with a $sign. And because the student had never used jQuery before, they were unfamiliar with the convention to prefix jQuery object variable names with $signs. So they were confused what the difference between those variables and the non-prefixed ones were, until I explained what jQuery was, showed them the selector syntax, which obviously is a whole pivot and branch away from what they were originally learning.
Going through our observations, we came up with some hypothesis that when users encounter big knowledge gaps, they sometimes can't continue learning, or they get very blocked and also essentially cannot continue moving from there. So we saw this with one of our observations where the tutorial was too advanced and there wasn't much knowledge transfer in that sense, and there was nothing really to map it back to. When users encounter smaller knowledge gaps, they're sometimes able to continue, but they don't completely understand what they're doing. So one user didn't walk away with a better understanding of what was actually happening, but was able to learn the best practice for resolving the error. In another observation, we found that the user said, I could fix this error in the future, but I didn't understand why I was fixing it.
And from those sort of user experiences, we came up with two classes. All the users that we talked to were very motivated, but what they were motivated to complete differed between the classes. So first were the class of users who were most interested in building or implementing some product or idea that they already had in mind. And that's not to say that these users didn't care at all about learning the underlying technologies or concepts, but in general, they were more concerned with getting the project to work. They were willing to have a looser or weaker conceptual understanding if they could make the bug go away, and or learn sort of a best practice thing to type without really understanding why said solution was a best practice.
And so based on our observations, these are some goals that we've identified. We want to help users identify their knowledge gaps. So whether or not they realize there is something or not, we want to make sure that A, if they don't realize they're missing something, they realize they're missing something, or B, if they have an intuition that they are missing something, we can directly point to what exactly that is. So we want to also help a learner determine if a learning material is appropriate for them given their current knowledge. And then thirdly, we want to help a user determine what prerequisites they need for approaching a specific learning material or problem.
So in the next week, our main goals or the next sprint are to prototype out some potential solutions, lo-fi solutions for resolving these particular goals, and testing them with more users who are roughly at the same level trying to learn a particular concept or technology, to see how these tools are able to help them identify their knowledge gaps and choose learning material at their appropriate level.
Bye.
Thanks.